Within the Leagues of Votann Codex, there is a small section of background that informs us of how unlikely the kin are to fall to chaos. Due to their resistance to psychic abilities, the chances of mutation and demonic possession are very low. But rare doesn't mean impossible. So, what if a Votann core, the hyper-advanced AI that the Leagues follow, became less benevolent and more malevolent? What if it became corrupted either through its own degradation or through outside influence? Well, in this video I hope to explore that scenario as I bring the Chaos Dwarves into the 41st millennium and Kitbash a member of the Leagues of Hashut. I began my Kitbash with this box of Chthonian Beserks, which were kindly sent to me early by Games Workshop. The less armoured and more close combat orientated style fit in perfectly with that chaos-influenced aesthetic. So, to begin, all the parts required to build one of the Beserks carrying a hammer were clipped away and cleaned up of any mold lines. From here, the torso, legs and arms were all attached, but the hammer and the head were left apart for the time being. The inspiration for the head came from the combination of the old Forge World Chaos Dwarves and the Horns of Hashut warband. In both cases, the helmets were mostly enclosed, with visibility being provided by a grate. A good source of these types of heads are the Dark Eldar racks, but their masks are just that, a mask. So it would need to be grafted onto the front of one of the Chthonian Beserks' heads. To make room for this, I clipped away the squat's face. The flat surface that was left behind was trimmed back a little further with my knife until the rack's mask was able to be glued into place. Once done, the head could then be attached to the torso. The mask was a good start, but the whole bull motif of Hashut could be used to further separate these guys from their non-chaos influenced cousins. The horns would come from a bloodletter head from the Citadel skull set and would allow me to include a dead animal bits in this video. The tips of the horns were clipped away, just at the point where they began to bend. After a quick comparison against the head, both the base of the horns and the contact points were shaved flat before being glued into place on the head. There was just one final tweak to be made to the head before I could call it done, and that was to add that classic Chaos Dwarf beard. This was sculpted using some green stuff. A small amount was cut and mixed before being rolled in short, stubby cylinders. These would make up the curled sections of the beard and were placed beneath the mask, one next to the other. A few of these did need to be shorter than the others in order to accommodate for the shoulder, so adjust the length as necessary for whatever torso you're working on. With the green stuff cylinders in place, the rings of curled hair could be created by gently pressing horizontal lines into the cylinders using a sharp tool. This can be made a little easier by allowing the green stuff to firm up a bit first, and by using some Vaseline or water on your tools to prevent the putty from sticking. With the recesses applied, the rounded part of a rubber-tipped sculpting tool was used to press a slight dimple into the base of the cylinder, creating the beard. For the next modification, I again took inspiration from the Fantasy and Age of Sigmar renditions of Hashut's followers. Both feature bulky looking scale mail, and while an entire skirt of it might look out of place on this model, a small amount of this archaic armour would help to further separate this model from its original. These would be created with green stuff and milliput mixed together in equal parts. This was a bit of an experiment for me. Generally, green stuff is great for organic shapes due to its elasticity and smoothness, whereas milliput is better for creating sharper, more defined shapes due to its ability to be cut and sanded once dry. I'd read that mixing them together can borrow a bit from both, so I gave it a go. After mixing, the miller stuff was rolled out flat so that it was just a millimeter or two thick. From here, it was left to one side for a couple of hours. With the miller stuff curing, work could be started on some of the other parts of the model. Mutations and body horror are common themes among the forces of chaos, so pushing the pre-existing bionics into more crude directions seemed like a good way to represent this. This effect was pretty straightforward to achieve and involved using a pin vise to drill 6 1mm wide holes into a few places across the Beserk's back and shoulders. Into these holes, some 1mm plastic rod was glued into place before being clipped down so just a few millimeters were left protruding. The result was that of crude cybernetics that also played into the theme of Chaos models, often featuring spikes in some way. Considering that the regular non-Chaos Votann have a unit called Beserks, it's safe to say that the Hashut following Beserks would have been driven to the extremes of rage. So much so that between battles they need to be chained down to prevent them from rampaging through their own ranks. To represent this on the model, I grabbed some of these lengths of chain found within the Flagellant's kit, and simply glued a couple of them directly to the exposed bionic spine on the back of the torso. The putty hadn't quite finished curing yet, so the weapon would be the next area to be customized. Continuing with the bull theme, I took advantage of the plentiful number of horns found in the Citadel skull set and grabbed one of the Beastmen skulls. The horns were clipped away from the skull in such a way that the cuts ran parallel to the direction of the horns. Once removed from the skull, the horns were compared against the sides of the hammer, and both sides were trimmed and flattened back until the horns could be mounted to it. With everything fitting together, the horns were glued into place, with them facing forward, simultaneously creating a larger weapon whilst also giving it a slightly more chaotic theme. Finally, the hammer was attached to the rest of the model. By this point, the Miller stuff had cured just enough to hold its shape, whilst still being soft enough to cut easily. The sheet was first cut into strips of around 3mm in width. From here, some trapezoid or trapezium shapes would be cut out. The directions of the cuts were alternated to get the most out of the material. Once a few of these segments had been cut out, a small hole was pressed into the top of each one using a sharp pointed tool. This gave the effect of a fixture point and helped to add a little detail to each one. After allowing the segments to fully cure, they were then superglued into place around the waist, with a slight angle being added to imply the forward movement of the model, and with that, the model was ready to be painted. But before we go on with the painting, let me introduce the sponsor of this video, Squidmart. He and the team have recently launched a Kickstarter for their new range of 75mm miniatures. Champions of Sona features 10 new miniatures, which depict the various characters and races that inhabit the world of Sona. Now, I'm not normally one for painting larger miniatures like these, but after tackling Lorgar a few months ago, I really got a taste for painting these larger scale models. The character you can see me painting here is Karanti, a member of the Elves of Iko, a formerly technologically advanced race that has begun to find their equipment and weapons slowly failing. It's an incredibly detailed model and has been great fun to paint, allowing me to hone my abilities with glazes and highlights. But this isn't the only race on offer within the campaign. There are barbarian like Anori who wield the power of necromancy, but without the typically evil aesthetic that often accompanies practitioners of these arts. And finally, we have the Orcs of Drakonzan, who are a surprisingly compelling combination of your classic fantasy orcs with Aztec-inspired theming. They also feature an orc shaman flying atop a giant owl, and you can't get much cooler than that. The campaign still has a couple of weeks to go as of the release of this video, so head on over to the Kickstarter and check out the Champions of Sona for yourself. I'll include a link to the campaign in the description below so you can check it out. And with that, let's get back to the Chaos Dwarf. To start things off, the model was primed with a black primer, which was applied through my airbrush. This provided that all-important starting coat that would create a unified colour across the model, whilst also allowing the paint to get a better hold onto the surfaces. But before any paint was laid on top, I decided to create some pre-shading by lightly spraying a little Tamiya XF2 over the top of the primer. The airbrush was angled from above so that the white paint built up on the upper surfaces rather than in the deep recesses, which remained as the black primer. This step isn't necessary, but it helps to alleviate some of the problems you face when painting directly over black. It makes it much easier to get a good solid base coat, while still benefiting from the dark shaded recesses that a black primer offers. For the rest of the steps in this guide, I'll be using paints taken from Duncan Rhodes' own Tooth and Coats range of paints, which were very kindly sent to me to try out. Now, for each of these paints, I did exactly as suggested, mixed in a little water to them and applied those tooth and coats. The first of these was Griffon Claw, and this was used as a base coat for the exposed skin. This would create a good starting point for an unhealthy looking pallor that would really enhance that chaotic appearance. The base coats were then continued by giving the trousers, cables and beard a base coat of Doom Death Black. Now, by applying some slightly thinner layers for this particular step, I was able to benefit from that pre-shading that I'd applied earlier on. The panels on the trousers, the boots, and the wrapping around the wrist could then be tackled with a base coat of Scorched Earth. The handle of the hammer and the straps across the shoulders were painted with a reddish brown of Cuirass Leather. The last few base coats were focused on the metallics, which were particularly important for the follower of Hashut. Up first were the bronze areas, which included the mask, the horns on the hammer, the armour, and the small plates had been added around the waist. For all of these areas, Spartan Bronze was used. The final base coat was Scorched Silver, and naturally, this was used to paint the remaining steel parts of the model. After using these metallics, my paint water was refreshed so those metal flakes didn't find their way into the rest of my paints. The base coats were a good start, but the surfaces were looking a little flat and the details weren't really standing out. To fix this, some washes were applied, and these were also taken from the Tooth and Coats range. The first wash that I chose was Flesh Wash, and this was applied over the exposed flesh areas. It was applied straight from the bottle and allowed it to flow in the recesses. Once dry, this gave the area more of a flesh tone, whilst also darkening down some of those recessed areas. The washes were continued with Oblivion Black, which was applied across both the black and steel areas. The brown coloration of Battle Mud was then used to shade the leather and bronze areas, which not only darkened down those recesses, but also helped to give them a warmer tone. The shading created by the washes was a good start to build up that detail, but these could be pushed even further with a few layers and highlights. This process was started with some Griffon Claw, which was thinned out with a little water before being applied as what I usually refer to as a layer. This is pretty much a base coat, but when the paint is applied, it isn't applied into the recesses, only on the raised surfaces. This approach was taken on the flesh as the wash had darkened down the skin a little too far, so it just needed to be lightened up a little bit more. Once the layer had dried, some fine lines of Ivory Tusk were painted over the skin in order to give the musculature a little more definition. The pallid flesh tone was a good start, but that body horror effect of metal rods could be pushed even further by glazing a little purple around them. This glaze was created by heavily thinning out some glistening gums with water until a translucent paint was created. This was applied to the skin around the various bionics, creating a subtle adjustment in the skin tone while still allowing those previous highlights to show through. From here, the rest of the model could be highlighted. Each of these would be approached in two steps. The first was a conventional highlight using one of the mid-tone paints found in the Tooth and Coat range. These paints, Death Reaper in this particular case, were used to paint fine lines along the edges and raised details. This lighter colour helps to further separate the darker recessed colours from the raised details, making them more prominent in turn. Death Reaper was used here to pick out the raised details in the areas that had been tackled with Doom Death Black earlier on. The second stage of highlighting was to take one of the highlight paints and use this only on the most prominent edges. By limiting it to only the most defined edges or where two edges meet to create a point, this even lighter paint can be used to add a degree of sharpness to certain details. In this case, I used some Dungeon Stone Grey. Following the same principles as before, the cooler brown areas were the next to be tackled. These were first highlighted with some Ancient Forest, before some extreme highlights were added using some Wasteland Brown. The edges of the reddish-brown leather areas were given an edge highlight of Boar Hide, followed by some Fur Cloak for the most prominent points. The metallic areas were tackled in the exact same way. First, some Dragon's Gold was painted over the details in the bronze areas, and then a small amount of Glistening Gold was applied over the sharper points. The final parts of the model to highlight were the steel areas. Plate armour was used initially, with the last highlight being Mythril Blade that was focused onto the most defined details. By this point, the model was pretty much complete, but the scheme featured a lot of drab-looking colours. I needed something brighter and more intense to help push that fiery intensity of this Hashut devoted Berserker. To create a glowing heat effect, some white star was painted into the grills of the mask. It was ever so slightly watered down to help it flow inside the recesses, and, once complete, a little more white paint was used to sketch out some runes onto the metal plates around the waist. Over this white base coat, some diluted orange flare was applied. By painting it over the white, the orange appeared much more intense than if it had been painted over the original colour. It didn't need to be completely precise either, as the overspill would help with that glowing effect. The orange was a good start, but to really push the intensity of the heat, some yellow flame was painted into the bottom half of the recesses in the mask. Similarly, when painted over the runes, only parts of the symbols were picked out with the yellow, leaving some of the orange paint still visible. The effect was completed by adding a little more white star to just the very bottom of the grills and as small dots over the runes. This left me with a gradient that simulated the appearance of intense heat emanating from beneath the mask. And with that, the model just needed a base and a varnish, which left me with this. So, that concludes this Chaos Corrupted Leagues of Votann Kitbash. It was pretty inevitable that I would end up giving this army a Chaos makeover at some point, but I didn't want to just go down the usual route of Khorne or Nurgle. The problem was Hashut was an entirely new aesthetic for me, and initially it was quite challenging. Importing a god that was normally only resided on the fancier side of Warhammer into the grimdark universe did require a lot of trial and error, but I think I managed to achieve that classic Elf Dwarf style on the 40k miniature. If you enjoyed this build or would like to see me tackle more Leagues of Votann Kitbashes in the future, then let me know in the comments below along with your ideas for homebrew leagues. As I mentioned earlier, nearly all the paints used in this guide were taken from the Duncan Rhodes Tooth and Coats range, and I was really happy with the results. If you're a fan of Citadel paints, you really can't go wrong with them. The range is a little more limited in colours, at least for the time being, but that's nothing that can't be resolved with a little paint mixing. Now before I go, let me say a big thank you to my ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jack Ewan, Jonathan Hart, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Jesse Smith, Joachim Falk, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. So if you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.